Your body is a Monsterland. It's Segaiden episode 61. The good news is that Sega's Master System sophomore slump ends here. The bad news is that Sega themselves aren't the one to break it. Instead, that honor goes to Westone, whose Wonder Boy once again proves himself to be the true mascot for the Sega Master System. Does that matter though? A win is a win, and Wonder Boy in Monsterland wins big for Master System. Last episode, I explored the curious trend among Sega-developed sequels for Master System to file down any hint of adventure or RPG that their previous games had demonstrated in favor of simple, streamlined action. Westone went the opposite way here, jumping enthusiastically upon the action RPG trend that had become so prevalent over on Famicom. The original Wonder Boy had unabashedly set out to claim a piece of the Super Mario Bros. Pie, with its linear, ratchet-scrolling action set in 8 worlds with 4 stages apiece. Much like Mario, protagonist Tom could run and jump, acquire projectiles, hunt for invisible secrets and hidden bonus zones, acquire temporary power-ups that allowed him to breeze through the action and take on identical, but actually nominally unique, bosses at the end of each of the 8 worlds. Wonder Boy in Monsterland does not do any of that. Although its stages do retain a largely linear design, there aren't 32 of them, and they don't consist of straightforward obstacle courses. The levels allow you to backtrack and wander from the main path to hunt for optional rooms or secrets. You usually need to acquire a key in order to complete a stage, which means fighting a boss in its lair, though often you need to actually figure out which room belongs to the real stage boss. Tom no longer picks up temporary powers like hand axes and skateboards. Instead, you acquire permanent upgrades, including armor and swords, and you collect them by paying cash at shops or defeating a specific enemy in order to claim their gear. It's almost, but not quite, a member of the Metroidvania family. There's some small irony in Wonder Boy in Monsterland arriving on Master System alongside Zillion 2, a game that could have pushed its predecessor's Metroidvania-leaning tendencies into a full-on action RPG, but instead meekly pulled back in favor of a nice-looking, but generally unremarkable run-and-gun. Now admittedly, I'm approaching this from the angle that Metroidvania is inherently a desirable or aspirational form of game design, a premise I hold to be fundamentally true, but realize has at least a little subjectivity about it. I'm right, of course, but still, not everyone agrees. Sega certainly didn't agree, preferring by and large to lean into their arcade heritage, and offering rip-roaring action games that tested players' reflexes, pattern recognition, and willingness to commit to the bit and master a game stage by stage in order to drag themselves slowly toward the end goal through repeated plays. An open-ended action RPG with progressive upgrades and permanent gating and maybe even a save feature didn't really jibe with that philosophy. Except it kind of did, as we see in Wonder Boy and Monsterland. This game didn't quite go full Metroidvania on us, putting a firm hand against players' backs and propelling them forward with a fairly strict timer counting down their limited lives with no continues in each stage. But it does a fine job of imitating the form of a proper platform action RPG like Zelda 2 or Castlevania 2. And it hailed originally from arcades. Like Wonder Boy before it, Monsterland got its start as a coin-op title. That heritage certainly does show through at times. From the stage timer to the lack of a proper, that is to say, non-hidden continue feature, to the unrelenting difficulty level, Wonder Boy in Monsterland does have a real quarter-muncher ethos to it. But that ethos had begun to evolve in the mid-80s, or at least to experiment with evolutionary dead ends. There's a tendency to look at the flood of action RPGs that inundated Nintendo's console for a few years and wag a finger at that rascally Dragon Quest for changing the way Japan's designers thought about video games, even action games. But I don't think that's quite accurate. Dragon Quest's success certainly influenced games, but I'd argue that it resulted from the same trend that gave us Wonder Boy in Monsterland, rather than directly spawning Wonder Boy in Monsterland. Once early RPGs arrived in Akihabara on a boat from America, aspiring game designers all across Japan fell in love with them and began inventing their own takes on the format. Of course, this resulted in no end of traditional takes on turn-based role-playing, like the Black Onyx and Dragon Quest, but many developers went in a different direction and embraced action-oriented dynamics that minimized or fully eliminated the use of menus. Once Nihon Falcom delivered the rogue-esque Dragon Slayer, everyone was off to the races. That included Namco, the towering arcade powerhouse who would of course bring us the Tower of Jiraga. But before Jiraga could run, Dragon Buster had to crawl. Dragon Buster arrived just a few months after Dragon Slayer, and mere weeks after the coin-op version of Irem's Jackie Chan brawler Kung Fu Master. Dragon Buster effectively split the difference between those two, bringing the sort of role-playing trappings you found on home computers into the combat action milieu of a coin-op title. Dragon Buster wasn't a proper role-playing game, but it introduced a lot of RPG-like elements into a space that had been primarily dominated by single-screen Donkey Kong-alikes. The hero of Dragon Buster ran through scrolling rooms that branched and led players down different paths toward the finale. He could run and jump, and he could withstand multiple enemy attacks thanks to his health meter. He acquired better equipment and skills by defeating bosses and their minions. Dragon Buster's sword combat and freewheeling fantasy style inspired quite a few games in the coming years, including Wing of Medulla and Zelda 2. And in arcades, it led to the advent of games with RPG-like systems. Sega actually kind of arrived there ahead of the pack with Fantasy Zone, a game that owed pretty much nothing to Dragon Buster. It approached the idea of the RPG from a different direction, incorporating an economy into its shooting design that allowed players to collect cash and purchase weapons in shops. At the same time, you began to see games like Rygar and Rastan Saga, which built on the combat mechanics and forward momentum of Dragon Buster for their more simplistic barbarian fantasy action games. All of these influences began to coalesce in 1987 when both Westone and Capcom began to combine everything into lightweight action RPGs like Black Tiger and Wonder Boy and Monsterland. Swords and magic and shops and dragons, these games neatly brought the workings of role-playing adventures into an environment built around the concept of coaxing a coin drop from players every 3 minutes. Honestly, Capcom was probably better at this than Westone. Black Tiger was sufficiently stacked against the player to whittle down their health meter pretty quickly and force them to insert another coin in order to continue. Wonder Boy and Monsterland instead gave players a few lives and no continues, driving them to refine their skills in order to press ahead on 1 credit. But it's a game that takes about 40 minutes to complete in its entirety. You have to imagine that arcade operators dreaded the sight of a skilled Wonder Boy and Monsterland player, knowing that machine would only generate 25 cents of revenue for the next half hour. And that's probably why Capcom continued incorporating RPG-light elements, namely shops for spending Zenny coins, into games from all sorts of genres well into the 90s, whereas Westone shifted its focus more toward console gaming. Because really, Wonder Boy and Monsterland belongs on home consoles. It requires a little too much patience and planning in order to truly vibe with the high-stress energy of an arcade. The constant noise and chaos of a packed game center sit at odds with a game where you need to make your way through dungeons and caverns with precise sword combat while making smart choices at the local retailers. But in the comfort of your own home, perfection. Wonder Boy in Monsterland sees Tom Tom set off on his adventure unarmed, which, in fairness, is how the previous game worked too, but you can only run so far to the right here. On the second screen, you'll encounter a tall, impassable wall. You can only move forward in the game by entering the door you find here, or one of those handy old people who live in RPG worlds kindly gives you a sword, a resurrection potion, and an elevator block that gives you a ride to the top of the wall. Once you begin the journey proper, you quickly realize that it's a different sort of game from the original Wonder Boy. I mean, yes, you can jump over most enemies instead of engaging them, as in the earlier game, but there's no real value in doing so. If you approach Wonder Boy in Monsterland like a high-speed athletic platformer, you'll eventually hit a wall. You ultimately need to fight certain enemies in order to make progress, and you need to juice up your abilities in order to face those monsters. So you need to stand and fight with the sword you receive at the beginning of the adventure. That sword has a downright pitiful attack range, which forces you to take on monsters in a totally different way than you did in Wonder Boy. You don't have throwing axes, so you have to get up close and mind your distance from a foe in order to strike it without stumbling into it. Now, you can collect magic spells that can come in handy, but those cost a lot of cash and don't make sense as tools to use against minor foes, so you want to save them for boss encounters. And there are so many other things you can spend money on that you need to spend money on. Monsterland is full of buildings and caverns, lined with doors that you can duck into to speak with people. Most of those people want to sell you things, whether that's permanent gear upgrades, consumable items, or health refills. All of those things cost money, and there's not a lot of that to be found in Monsterland. Or rather, you could theoretically grind for and stockpile cash, but because you have a timer constantly ticking down as you fight your way through the game, you can't afford to just stand around and harvest money. Once that little hourglass in the heads-up display ticks down, the egg timer flips and you lose a point of health. You don't have a lot of health points to begin with, and you only have a few lives and no continues, So time truly is the most precious resource you have access to. Each shop gives you a couple of choices on how to spend your money, usually involving two tiers of the same item with unexplained benefits. Which is better, the shield that costs 40 gold or the one that costs 120? I mean, clearly the 120 gold shield is the superior choice, but good luck figuring out why without referring to the manual. And in the early going, it's not really a true choice anyway. You might have enough cash to afford the low tier item, but the enhanced option is well out of range. Rather, your initial choices tend to be more a matter of which type of item to buy. You can only afford a shield to block projectiles or boots to improve your running speed and jumping range, but not both, so which do you invest in? Once you get a handle on these play elements, you start to realize how much of an illusion the RPG mechanics of Wonder Boy and Monsterland actually are. It's not really a role-playing game per se, because a linear action game with a finite economy and strict time limits only allows you to stray from a predetermined path so much. For example, the shoes versus shield question. Well, immediately after you leave the shops that sell those items, you have to begin dealing with enemies that fire projectiles at you from off-screen. Although you can jump over these attacks, doing so is a little tedious, and more to the point, it can be dangerous, since there are other enemies who go after you erratically while the arrows come flying in at regular intervals. So you really need to buy a shield. The shoes can wait until next time, but at that point you'll likely need to choose between boots and healing, and you may not be able to afford both. The correct solution to success in Wonder Boy and Monsterland is to discover and memorize all the hidden secrets in the game. Invisible money, invisible doors, invisible NPCs. Not only is that the only way to stockpile enough cash to power you through to the end, those invisible secrets also hold the key to completing the game correctly, since they hide critical quest items. So it's very much a game in the Druaga vein, like Wonder Boy or, say, Mylon's Secret Castle. Keep grinding your way to success, keep hunting for secrets, keep memorizing the critical path, and keep trying until you can pull it all off perfectly. It's an interesting midpoint between the original Wonder Boy and the exceptional The Dragon's Trap. It's limited in scope and freedom, and often quite demoralizing when a good run ends abruptly. But those are pretty minor flaws in the face of an adventure that does so much right. That makes it a real standout in the Master System library. And hey, it's an arcade port, despite its RPG leanings. That means it's an authentic Sega release, despite itself. Given the excellence of Wonder Boy and Monsterland, Sega actually took the time to acknowledge the existence of this one. The third issue of Sega Challenge included a full-page advertorial on the game. Sega Challenge was still more Fun Club news than Nintendo Power at this point, so all of this amounted to little more than a breezy press release. No strategies, maps, breakdowns of game mechanics, or essential cheat codes, but it's a start. Next time on Segaiden, Master System's Livin' on a Prayer.